EP Magazine's annual healthcare issue contains a wide selection of articles for parents, caretakers, professionals who care for children and youth with special healthcare needs, including families who have multiple children with disabilities. Further topics include early intervention, oral care, medical bills, and physical fitness, concerns faced by most families, but especially challenging to those with special needs. Read it today at www.epmagazine.com.
Oscar Mike Radio is a proud podcast partner of Reach Across America Radio, heard every Thursday at 11 a.m. and Sunday at 8 a.m. Eastern. They're also big supporters of the nonprofit I Got Your Six, Two Lives at Once. And with every wreath you sponsor through Oscar Mike Radio, $5 goes back to this great organization dedicated to making a difference in the lives of veterans, law enforcement, firefighters, and first responders battling PTSD. Two Lives at Once pairs these brave men and women together with dogs rescued from kill shelters. In this way, two lives are saved at the same time by saving each other. Donate now. Go to reachacrossamerica.org/Oscar Mike Radio to help. That's reachacrossamerica.org/Oscar Mike Radio.
Suicide is preventable, and each of us has a role to play in suicide prevention.
Suicide is complex. There is no single cause.
And it's not always a mental health issue. It could be loss of a job or home, financial or relationship issues, pain, or leaving the military.
Suicide does not discriminate. It affects all ages, races, and genders, veterans or not.
If you know a veteran who is struggling, connect with them. Let them know help is available.
There is quick and easy access to services in times of crisis.
Dial 988, then press 1. Talking about it is okay.
Don't keep it inside. Don't be ashamed. Don't wait. Reach out.
Find resources at va.gov/reach.
Hello and welcome again to Oscar Mike Radio. My name is Travis. I am your host. Oscar Mike Radio is part of the Hubazoo Network. You can find out more on hubazoo.com. I want to thank my sponsors, Joyce Asack of Asack Real Estate, Army National Guard veteran Mark Holmes of Reapers Detailing and Power Washing, and my supporters, Kason Shaving Company, Exceptional Parent Magazine, and Black Cat Designs. I got connected with my next guest, and I do what I do with every show. I start digging into their LinkedIn, digging into the website, YouTube videos, and I was immediately in. This next guest is going to talk about a segment of our history and people who served our country that you may not know much about. I certainly didn't. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mitchell Maki from the Go for Broke Educational Center to Oscar Mike Radio. Doctor, thank you for your time and welcome.
Travis, my pleasure to be here.
Doctor, I got approached about this and then I reached back out, and your National Education Foundation, the Go for Broke Center, is about teaching people about the Japanese, the Nisei. Did I say that right?
That's correct.
The Nisei service members who served their country during World War II at a time when, if you were a Japanese national or Japanese American, you were either, and I'm ashamed to say this, in a camp, or shunned and ridiculed and mocked and ostracized. And so I'm like, wow, there's a whole story that Yeah, we know we did that, but you never really hear the human side of it. And then I read about how you all have supported the education, how you all have gotten into this. So let's just start at the beginning. How do you how did you get involved with this organization?
That I wasn't expecting to start with me. I was expecting to start with the story, but
We will, we will,
certainly
we will.
I grew up knowing about this story. My uncle was a member of the 442nd Company E. He was from Hawaii. And as a young child, my parents are from Hawaii, so my personal family was not incarcerated during World War II. And I remember learning about the incarceration, thinking, "Oh, it can't be Japanese Americans like me, and my family." And then come to learn that yes, it was Japanese Americans like my parents, like my grandparents, like me, who were sent off to these camps across the nation. And it was people like my grandfather who, despite that treatment, went on to serve and become a member of the most highly decorated unit of its size in American military history. And I remember even as a young boy, 10, 11, 12 years old, I thought, wow, I got to learn more about this. And that was half a century ago, and I'm still learning about it.
So how did Go for Broke get going? Because I would love to go down the road of your personal story and your family living in Hawaii, but more than that, where did this organization come from? Because you read about the organization, you understand, what you all are doing in terms of education, supporting these veterans who did serve during this time, and then making sure their stories are told in amazing ways. So, where does Go for Broke come from, and how do you all serve?
Well, Go for Broke National Education Center started off as the Go for Broke Foundation nearly 35 years ago when the veterans were relatively young men. These World War II veterans at that time were in their 60s and wanted to make sure that their legacy would never be forgotten. And I say that meaning that it wasn't about, look what I did, but look what our community did. And look what it means to truly be an American and to serve this nation, even at a time when the nation doubts your loyalty. And so a number of these veterans, along with their officer, Colonel Young Ok Kim, who was Korean American at the time, and that's a whole nother story that we can get into, but he felt that just as strongly, and they got together in Los Angeles and created the Go for Broke Foundation that later would become the Go for Broke National Education Center. And there are similar clubs or organizations, not of our size and not with our exact mission, but in Hawaii and in other parts of the United States that continue to tell this story.
And just for people out there who may not know or just think this is just impossible, could you remind us what the story is? You know, it's not enough to say, hey, these people served during a time of trouble and strife, but really, if you were Japanese, it's my understanding, if you were Japanese, you weren't allowed, you weren't welcomed, you weren't anything. And I've tried to get my head around that. It's not that I don't understand it. It's just hard to make that real to me.
We're talking about the United States 80 years ago, 80 some years ago, a different time and different place in some ways. And in some ways, there are reflections of that time even with us today. So it's an important story that everyone needs to understand. So December 7th, 1941, the imperial nation of Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, and it thrusts the United States into World War II. Japanese Americans, like my parents, like my grandparents, began to wonder what would happen to us. Would we be treated like the American citizens we were, or would we be treated like the enemy because we shared a common heritage? Now, just to add some context to that, people my parents' age, my father and mother were born in the mid 1920s in the territory of Hawaii. They were American citizens by birth. Japanese Americans who were born on the continental United States similarly were American citizens by birth. my grandparents who immigrated to Hawaii around 1900. So they had been here in Hawaii as well as others on the mainland for 30, 40, some 50 years.
Generations.
Exactly. And Travis, why didn't my grandparents naturalize? If they had come here in 1900 and they were still here in 1941 when Pearl Harbor happened, they had never gone back to Japan. Why didn't they naturalize?
I don't know.
And the simple answer is because legally they were prohibited from naturalizing.
Really?
Asians and Japanese in particular were considered aliens ineligible to citizenship. So they were prohibited from being American citizens, even though they had lived here 30, 40, 50 years and were Americans by practice, by tradition, and by loyalty. So
No, wait,
shortly
wait, wait a
after,
minute. Now, juxtapose that with the Europeans and other people coming over through Ellis Island back in the day, and they were allowed in, but Asians were not.
they were allowed in, but they weren't allowed to naturalize and
Okay.
become American citizens.
Wow.
So shortly after Pearl Harbor, immediately in Hawaii, the Japanese Americans who were in the Hawaii National Guard had their guns taken away from them, and they were deemed 4C, unfit for duty, enemy alien. Eventually, President Roosevelt, 2 months later, February 19th, 1942, would sign Executive Order 9066, which would set the underpinnings by which nearly 120,000 individuals of Japanese ancestry on the west coast of the continental United States would be rounded up, not given a choice, rounded up and sent off to one of 10 what were called WRA camps, War Relocation Authority camps, but which were essentially incarceration centers. And they would spend the next 2 to 4 years of their lives in these camps. It's important to note that the Japanese Americans in Hawaii were not rounded up in mass. The leaders were taken away and were sent off to camp, but for the most part, the average family was left alone. And that's kind of an interesting point because you would think if it were for military necessity, Pearl Harbor is where we had been attacked. Pearl Harbor was a lot closer to Japan. The reason the Japanese Americans weren't incarcerated in Hawaii, well, one of the primary reasons is because they made up about 40% of the workforce of the islands. And so if you were to incarcerate all the Japanese Americans, that would collapse the economic structure of Hawaii.
What was it like after Pearl Harbor happened in Hawaii? And to your analysis, 40% of the population is Japanese American. What was it like for them having to work and deal with all that? Because immediately, the Battle of Midway and the push towards the Philippines and Japan happened. What was it like for them during that time?
You have to understand that in 1941, there were a lot of non-white faces in Hawaii. A lot of different ethnicities, and not only Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, Filipino Americans, and so as well as the native Hawaiian population and so forth. So on the ground level, if you will, these Japanese Americans grew up there. They felt like they were a part of the community, and then things change overnight where there's suspicion and there's feeling as if these are not to be trusted Americans. Versus on the continental United States, they are a vast minority. And as I mentioned, eventually, within 6 months of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, they've been rounded up, they've been sent off to these camps that are sprinkled across the United States. The other thing to remember is, especially for those that were on the island of Oahu, where Pearl Harbor is, for Japanese Americans there, this wasn't some distant, faraway place that nobody had ever heard of. Most Americans had never heard of Pearl Harbor before December 7th, right? This was their backyard. I can't tell you, Travis, how many people I've spoken to who were there on December 7th in the morning. They felt the bombs hitting the ground. They heard the planes flying over. They saw the casualties. Some of the casualties were people they knew. And so for many of the Japanese Americans, as well as all the other ethnicities on the island, there was a sense of rage. Not only is have we been attacked by a foreign nation, they attacked our backyard. And there was a real sense of, we want to get into this fray. We want to be a part of getting back and protecting what is ours. And for the most part, initially, the Japanese American soldiers and those who wanted to become Japanese American soldiers were not allowed to.
Well, that was my next question is you have this going on in our country. You're in your home, and it seems unthinkable now, but it did happen that you're rounded up, you're put into these war relocation areas, and then you have young people sign up to serve our country. That just defies explanation. Like in today's age, if you did that, there's no way you could talk somebody into serving the very country that imprisoned them. What was the characteristics of these youth at that time that they wanted to do that?
You put your finger on the pulse of this whole story. And it's interesting when I speak to young people today about what happened and ask them, would you serve? Almost unanimously, the answer is, excuse my language, hell no. In the sense that I'm not going to serve a country that has taken everything from me. So let's talk about the continental United States
Okay.
for a moment, because that's where the incarceration took place en masse. Japanese Americans lost their homes, their jobs, their businesses. They were kicked out of schools on the West Coast, and they lost everything. They were given the opportunity to pack one bag, what they could carry, and then they were off to some unknown place, not knowing what would happen to them. And then about a year into the incarceration, so in 1943, the Army comes up with the idea of, let's create an all volunteer Japanese American unit that will serve as a segregated unit. So it wasn't to simply go out and fight, but they would serve together. And I ask that question of young people today, both males and females. Would you serve a nation that had done this for you? Would you go and fight for liberty and justice halfway around the world while your own family is behind barbed wire? And again, this unit was designed to go and fight in Europe against the Nazis. And invariably, the answer is hell no. But back then, in 1943, in Hawaii, on the first day that young men could sign up, 10,000 young men in Hawaii signed up to say, send me. On the mainland, much smaller number, given that they were in camp, but still on that first day, 1,200 said, send me, I will go. And thousands, literally thousands, would follow. And the question is, why?
Yeah.
Why would they serve? And part of the answer, Travis, is because they knew who they were. These people, Nisei, as you mentioned earlier in the podcast, which means second generation, the way Japanese Americans count generations, the immigrants were the first generation. The first generation born here is considered the second generation in America, but they were American born. They had grown up in the US. They had gone to American schools. They spoke English at school and then maybe went home and spoke Japanese to their parents. They ate, American food at home and in restaurants, and then maybe at home ate Japanese food. So they truly were Japanese American in terms of having this bicultural experience.
Yeah.
But in terms of allegiance, in terms of knowing who they were American. Many of these guys didn't even speak fluent Japanese. I mean, they may know a few words and so forth. The vast majority had never been to Japan, and they grew up like their white American and black American counterparts, listening to American music, wanting to go to dances and hang out with the girls and all that kind of good stuff that 18-year-old young men like to do, right? But it was an incredibly difficult decision, as you can imagine, because for those that said, we need to go because we need to demonstrate who we are and prove that we are loyal Americans. The counter argument was, how can you support a nation that takes everything from your family? And in addition to that, you have to remember they're in the middle of deserts and swamplands surrounded by barbed wire. Their parents are older, some of them becoming elderly, and their parents would say, we don't know what's going to happen to us as a family. We have to stay together, keep the family together. So it not only is an individual choice of, do I do this or not, but do I abandon my family, who we're all scared because we don't know what's happening to us and so forth. And my parents, some of the parents wanted them to stay. Other parents would say, go if you must and try to stay alive, but do not bring dishonor onto the family.
Wow.
And
Even wait, even a doctor, even through all that, your grandparents, your parents come to this country, you're born in this country, you're in every respect an American, and through no fault of your own, from people a half a world away, do this thing called Pearl Harbor, and it changes the course of the history, right? Bef- they're in an internment camp, cut off. Don't bring dishonor to your family.
yes.
That's you don't see that every day. Even in the history books, it's just stay alive, but don't bring dishonor. The reason I want to focus on that is that, to me, is a very unique part of the Japanese culture that they brought to the United States.
Yes. So
Where does that come from?
you're seeing that blending of
Okay.
the Japanese values as well as the American values,
Yeah,
right?
so explain that value, that just what's that value of don't bring dishonor? Where's that come from?
Well, in the Japanese traditional Meiji era Japanese culture, and that's the era from which the Issei, my grandparents immigrated from, the value of honor, personal honor, but even more important, family honor, was very important, was very central to how one saw the world and how one carried themselves. You know, and again, we could get into a very deep discussion about East versus West, American versus Japanese in terms of perspective. But clearly, the West and America, we focus on the individual
Right.
a great deal, and in the East and Japan in particular, it's really the group, and it's really what is best for the group, and by extension, what is best for the family, and that you are not an individual that only acts for yourself. You are an extension of the family, and whatever you do, good or bad, reflects onto the family. So that value, coupled with this very strong understanding, and I mean unquestionable understanding that we are American, that this is the land in which I was born. This is the land to which my parents have chosen to come and spend 30, 40 years living. There is no question in their mind. And let me also say, Travis, that throughout the World War II years, there was not one Japanese American who was convicted of any type of espionage or sabotage or acts against the United States.
I've
So
read that several times. That's not one instant.
so this perception that, oh, the Japanese Americans were a threat to America was really unfounded. And the other thing that I think we need to point out, because again, for your listeners, this is 80 years ago, and it's a different setting than where we are currently right now in many ways. But the Nazis were viewed as evil men. the Japanese from Japan, the Japanese Empire, were viewed as an evil subhuman species. The racism and the hysteria of war just really blended itself together in terms of how mainstream America viewed Japanese and by extension Japanese Americans. And there was no distinction between the two in the minds of the vast majority of people involved with the incarceration of Japanese Americans.
How did these units? Go ahead.
One last, and then
Sure.
I will answer the next question. But so one name that I want to put forward because he will come back in our story. There was a sergeant named Kazuo Masuda,
Okay.
and his family was incarcerated in one of the camps in Arizona, and he was serving with the 442nd. And he was asked, "Why are you doing this? Why are you putting yourself in harm's way, in death's way possibly, while your own family is behind barbed wire?" And his answer, I believe, is the answer that the vast majority of these young men would have given. And it was, because this is the only way that I know that my family can have a chance in America. Sergeant Masuda, right or wrong, understood that in 1943, 44, and 45, loyalty needed to be demonstrated in blood.
That's kind of like I'm thinking back to Nathaniel Hale in the Revolutionary War. It's that profound of a statement, Doctor. Speaking of these units and this sergeant who served, how did these units comport themselves or serve during World War II? Did they serve with distinction? Were they involved in any dangerous conflict? Can you go into that for me, please?
So in the first wave of soldiers, Japanese American soldiers who were sent out from Hawaii, and they were the original Hawaii National Guard that became the 100th Battalion, and they shipped out and served in Northern Africa and then in Italy, and they served with such distinction because at first nobody really wanted them. It's like, why would we take this untested group? Why would we take this group of what many of the military leaders thought of as the enemy versus as American soldiers? So they weren't highly sought after at the very beginning, but then they served with such distinction and started earning nicknames like the Little Men of Iron, because physically these Japanese American soldiers weren't very big. I mean, the average height was 5'4", 5'5", 125 pounds, soaking
wow.
wet. I've met a couple of Japanese American veterans who were 5'6" or 5'7", and they say, "Yeah, I was the big dude in the unit." uh, so, but they served with such distinction and such courage, in Northern Africa and in Italy. And the truth is, in many cases, they were the first ones in because they were used as cannon fodder to take the first wave of resistance from the Nazis and so forth. And it was based on their success that the Army decided to create a larger unit, which is now referred to as the Regimental Combat Team, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Between the two, the 100th Battalion would serve as the 1st Battalion of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. They continued to serve in Italy. They were then sent to France, northern France, and there they engaged in a battle called the Rescue of the Lost Battalion, and we can talk about that in a moment. And then they came back to Italy and helped to break the Gothic Line, which ended or was the beginning of the end of the Nazi resistance in World War II. By the time they came back to Italy, they were highly sought after by the different generals. General Mark Clark was definite that he wanted to keep them and so forth. In fact, when they were sent from France to Italy for their final campaign, they were sent under cover of night. They were told not to wear their emblems because the 442nd Regimental Combat Team was the only regiment that the Nazis would follow in particular. They had earned a reputation not only amongst the American forces, but also amongst the Nazis who
Yeah.
had come up against them in battle. And by the end of the war, the 100th 442nd became the most highly decorated unit of their size in American military history for their length of service. Unfortunately, most of those medals were Purple Hearts, which, as you know, one receives when one is wounded or killed. But they also received eventually 21 Medals of Honor.
21.
21 Medals of Honor for a regiment size. And they also received 7 presidential citations as a unit and numerous distinguished service crosses and silver stars and bronze stars and so forth. To give you an idea of the type of situations that they were put in when they were in northern France, and this is 1944, late September, early October, and they were engaged in fierce fighting in northern France, in the towns of Bruyères and Bifontaine, and they liberated those cities. And to this day, literally to this day, the cities of Bruyères and Bifontaine still celebrate the Japanese American units. They literally have named streets after them. They have an annual parade, and they even have uh, young people will dress up in the same uniforms as the 442nd and celebrate what the Japanese American soldiers did to liberate their city. In 2019, my daughter and I went and attended one of these parades. So that's what 4 or 5 years ago,
Yeah.
type of, and they every year, and they came out and were thanking us as if we were the ones who had actually done, the heroics. But I mean, they were so grateful. And I remember one grandfather, elderly man, he was with his, I presume, his grandson, and he said, "If it weren't for them, we would be speaking German today." Yeah. Shortly after they liberate these 2 towns, they get the orders, rather than getting a week's rest, or what normally the soldiers would get at that time to recuperate. There was a battalion of uh, mostly white American soldiers from Texas, about 275 of them, that were trapped in the Vosges Mountains in the forests, right, and they were surrounded by Nazi troops. And the army had tried to send in several battalions to break through to save this Lost Battalion, and none of them had experienced any success. Finally, they said, "Let's send in the 100th 442nd." They've had a good level of success, and also they were expendable. Well, the men of the 100th 442nd understood that all of them would walk into that forest, but not all of them would walk out. But they also understood that the eyes of the nation were upon them. And they did walk into that forest, and they did penetrate the Nazi line, and they did rescue the Lost Battalion, saving 211 soldiers in the process. But in the process of doing so, took over 300 casualties. But that was the math of the day. Yeah. And it was from that rescue, and because there were reporters there, there's even film footage of the white American soldiers from Texas walking out of the forest after being rescued. And that played in movie theaters in America as people would go and see the movies, and then they would get their news. And it was the first time the Japanese Americans, and in particular the Japanese American soldiers, were portrayed in a very positive light. And to the point that the governor of Texas at that time made all Japanese American soldiers of the 100th 442nd honorary Texans.
That's a big honor, especially for back then. I mean,
Yeah.
I just think back to our previous, conversation about honor, and I would hope that, and I don't know, maybe some of these parents got to see what their sons did over there to rescue these Texans. Um, What happened when the war ended to the 442nd? And then, take me through what happened to the Japanese citizens that were in these camps.
Okay. If I can tell you one more story
Sure,
before we get to that, and that is,
absolutely.
so what we've been focusing on is Europe and the role of Japanese American soldiers in Europe in the segregated unit that we've been referring to. But Japanese Americans also served in the Pacific Theater. And these were individuals who had some linguistic ability. They could speak Japanese, they could write and read Japanese. Some of them had spent some years in Japan as children, some had just been trained by their parents. So if they had any kind of linguistic ability, they were then sent off to Minnesota, to Fort Snelling, where they were enrolled in the military intelligence service. And then they were sent out to the Pacific Theater to serve as interpreters, translators, and intelligence officers for the different units. And this was a very different experience because they weren't in a segregated unit like the 100th 442nd were. There would be one Japanese American interpreter stationed with a Marine unit. And back then, the Marine unit knew nothing about them, and at first there was a lot of distrust. Who is this guy? And, well, I'm going to shoot him as soon as he does anything wrong, right? Type of thing. So, in just from the get-go, it's a very different setup where you're in a unit where you don't know everybody doesn't look like you, and there's a lot of distrust. Well, eventually they would earn the not only the trust and the admiration of their fellow soldiers, but really the loyalty of their fellow soldiers as their interpretation of coded messages, as their translation and interrogation of POWs would lead to incredible knowledge on the part of the Marines that were in the Pacific Theater. So they knew what the Japanese were about to do, right? I mean, General MacArthur even said that never in the history of wartime has an army. I'm paraphrasing this part.
Sure.
Has an army been so well prepared to know what the enemy is going to do? I mean, Travis, some of these experiences were these interpreters, these MIS soldiers, would crawl through the jungles up into the where the enemy Japanese were stationed and eavesdrop on them for several hours, listening to what the plans were and stuff and so forth, and then crawl back through the jungles back to their Marine unit and say, "Hey, they're attacking at dawn, or they're going to be doing X, Y, or Z," and so the Marine units were ready. There's a story of one of these MIS interpreters who, in Saipan, there had been some heavy, heavy fighting, and civilians were holed up in caves. And there was this one cave where there were about 100 civilians, and 8 Japanese soldiers were keeping them hostage. This particular MIS soldier, Kubo, volunteered to go into the cave and talk to the Japanese soldiers and to convince them to let the civilians go. And even his commanding officer at the time said, "I don't think that's a good idea." But he said, "No." But, what Kubo said was, "I've seen too many of our young Marines die. We've got to
Whoa.
try this." So he was lowered down. He did have a pistol stuck in his boot, but that wasn't the intent to go in and start a firefight. And as the story goes, as he went into the cave, he was immediately surrounded by these 8 Japanese soldiers who immediately thought he was a traitor. How can you be fighting for the
Right, right.
Americans and so forth? And then he talked to them and shared a story about it's a well-known feudal Japanese samurai story of a young man who had to choose between his father, his family, who was against the emperor, and he chose to support the emperor. And the basic feeling was, America is my country, and I need to support my country. And because he told it in that vein and that story that the Japanese soldiers could understand, they began to engage with him and so forth. Finally, he said to them, "Look, you're surrounded. Let these people go. you don't stand a chance anyway. And they said to him, we will let you go and we will decide what we want to do. And we will either let them out at around 2 o'clock or not. So Kubo was let go. And as they waited, sure enough, around 2 o'clock, people started streaming out. The civilians started streaming out of the cave. And eventually the 8 soldiers came out too and surrendered. So again, and there are numerous stories like this uh, that talk about how the work of the MIS soldiers helped to shorten the war in the Pacific theater, thus saving thousands and thousands of lives on both sides.
Right.
One other quick story is that there was an MIS soldier who was stationed stateside. His name was Kazuo Yamane. He was given a box of documents that had been captured. It fell off of a boat in the middle of the ocean. They thought it was worthless, but they said, look, it's all in Japanese. Go ahead and start to review it. He started reviewing it, and literally the first notebook that he pulled out of there described where all the armaments were being stored on mainland Japan. And it was from his translation that the army could go in there and pinpoint and destroy these stockpiles of armaments, and really it weakened Japan in a very serious way that they couldn't continue the war effort.
Right.
And to go to your question now, which is what happens after the war, those particular Japanese soldiers who were fighting in the Pacific theater, many of them would stay on and be joined by other Japanese American soldiers, and they would help to translate and interpret post-war Japan. So they helped in the war crime trials. They helped in the reintegration of hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers who were coming back from around the world. They helped to rebuild Japan and literally even helped in the writing of the Japanese Constitution that stands to today. So they were an integral part of rebuilding Japan. And as we know, Japan has become our most trusted and important ally in the Pacific theater.
Sure, especially with everything going on with Taiwan and
So then your question is, what happens after the war when all these Japanese American soldiers are
coming
returning,
back. Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So the war ends and the camps begin to close, and the Japanese Americans who were in these camps are given $25 and a one-way train ticket to reestablish their lives. And, some of them went east, but the majority of them came back to the West Coast where they had originally um, been living. And, as you can imagine, the concerns or the priorities that these families would have would be what all of us would have. Let's put a roof over our head. Let's put food on the table. Let's get a job. Let's send the kids back to schools. Let's start to rebuild our communities, right? But for the Japanese American community, there was also another feeling, and that was a feeling of shame that somehow we had done something to bring this egregious violation of the Constitution upon ourselves. We had not been we had not been American enough. So the feeling was, let's be 110% American so that this never happens to us again, right? And that's why a lot of times Japanese Americans my age, whose parents were in the camp, we don't speak Japanese because our parents didn't want us learning Japanese. They wanted us speaking the King's English. Yeah. And so therefore, that was the feeling that the general community had. But for the soldiers who were coming back, there was a different feeling, a feeling like, I just put my life on the line. I just saw my best buddy be killed. I lost my brother in this war. I'll be damned if I'm going to be treated like a second-class citizen any longer, right? And for the soldiers who went back to Hawaii in particular, and again, Hawaii is a different context than the mainland because there's a lot more Asians and there's a lot more Japanese Americans there per capita. Many of them went back and said, we're going to change our lives. They took advantage of the GI Bill. They went and got their college degrees. They became lawyers, doctors, businessmen, political leaders. So that's why now, if you visit Hawaii, right, they no other state can say that they've had 3 or 4 Japanese American senators. They've had 2 Japanese American governors. You look at the state legislature, and it is full of Japanese American names, right? The business leaders are Japanese American in Hawaii. And I jokingly say to people from Hawaii that I know, you cannot go grow up in Hawaii and go to public school and not have had a Japanese American teacher or Japanese American principal. I mean, the community transformed Hawaii into the state that it is now, and really contributed in major ways to making Hawaii what it is. And in fact, in 1959, Hawaii becomes the 50th state. So that's in a nutshell what happened in Hawaii. On the mainland, it was a little bit different because we still remained a vast minority, and for many Japanese Americans, they returned home and there was still the racism and the prejudice. Senator Dan Inoue, who eventually would become the senator from Hawaii, was a member of the 442nd. He lost his right arm in battle fighting for America. After the war, he went to San Francisco and wanted to get his hair cut, and the barber said, "I don't cut Jap hair." And that just is a story that kind of encapsulates the struggle that Japanese Americans had to reestablish their lives and to really help rebuild the community.
So
In 1952, in the 1950s, things start to change in America. In 1952, we have the McCarran-Walters Act, and that's when, for the first time, Japanese in Hawaii, in America, can naturalize and become American citizens, even though there was a very small number that were allowed to do so. 54, we have Brown versus Board of Education that says separate but equal is no longer the law of the land. The civil rights movement starts in the 50s. But for this story, what's important is in 1959, Hawaii becomes a state. And with that statehood, you get representation. And the first congressperson to be sent to the capital was Representative Dan Inoue, who I just talked about.
yeah,
Who gave his right arm in battle, lost his right arm in battle. And what better symbol of loyalty to send to the nation's capital than somebody like Representative and to be Senator Inoue?
these young men brought honor to their families and their communities, which leads me to, go for broke. Now, at first, I'm trying to understand how does go for broke, what's that mean in relation to the education part of telling the story? Doctor, I've read through the website. I'm like, I can't find the link. So it's been bugging me. Start me there. Where did that come from, please?
The term "go for broke."
Right. Well, I know what the term "go for broke" means, but how does it relate to the education and foundation that was created to keep these stories alive?
Okay. Well, first of all, for your listeners, because many of them may be saying, "Well, yeah, what does this go for broke mean?" Kind of thing. And go for broke is actually a gambling term. It essentially means go all in. Give it your all. And the soldiers, Japanese American soldiers, particularly the ones from Hawaii, loved to gamble. In their spare time in the barracks, all you could hear was dice rolling or people playing cards, or they'd bet on anything, right? And the term was, "Hey, let's go for broke. Let's push it all in, and we're going to give it our all." And it was that attitude that they brought to the battlefield, because they knew the stakes were even higher there. That what they're fighting for was not only our nation, not only the concepts that America stands for and the values that America stands for, but they literally were fighting for their place in America. They literally were fighting for recognition that America's promise is that in our nation, no one is to be judged by the color of their skin, the nation of their origin, or the faith that they choose to keep. And so let's go for broke. Let's go all in and make sure that we win this thing. So that's where the term comes from, and that's why it is the title of our organization. The lessons that our soldiers, our Japanese American soldiers, taught us. This is not just a great Japanese American story. To me and to all of us at Go for Broke National Education Center, this is a great American story. It's the story of the sons and daughters, because there were young women who volunteered for the WACs and for the nurse cadets during World War II, so we can't forget about them. But it's a story of the children of immigrants who in one generation served our nation in a time of war, even though they were mistreated, even though they were fighting against the nation from which their parents had immigrated. It's the power of what is an American, and what, and that ability to be an American is not limited to only certain people, but is open to all people who want to engage and be a part of our nation.
So how does Go for Broke then, the education part of this, keep that legacy alive? Because, looking at it, I'm like, there is a whole history back to the 1900s to now of what you all are doing. So kind of go into that, because it's a really fascinating idea of how you're doing this. It's more than just, hey, here's a person, here's what they did. You're involved in the community and teaching young people and going out and making sure that that honor stays alive.
Right. Travis, before I answer that question, let me share one other story, because it will
I love it.
be a
Go
part
ahead.
of my answer. For decades after the end of the war, Japanese Americans struggled with the idea of, were we wrong? Did we bring this egregious violation upon us? And for many families, they just said, let's not talk about it. Let's sweep it under the rug, right? Until in the 1970s and 1980s, members of the Japanese American community and eventually the whole community said, what happened to us was wrong, and we are deserving of an apology and reparations for what was done to our community. That's another 3-hour conversation that I'd love to have with you, that we can come back and talk about the nitty-gritty.
Absolutely.
But
will you right now, will you do that?
You got it. I will
All right,
come
all right.
back and let's, because that's another
Yeah.
fascinating story. But I'm gonna cut to the chase on this. Whereas in the 80s, we finally got it to the Congress, a bill that would apologize to Japanese Americans for this treatment and provide monetary reparations, right? And two stories that I'd like to tell, both involving veterans. So as we were lobbying for this bill in the Congress, in the House of Representatives, there was a representative, a moderate Democrat from Florida named Charles Bennett, and he was not supportive of this bill. So three members of the community, two who were community activists, and one whose name was Rudy Tokiwa, and Rudy had been a member of the 442nd. So they go and visit Charles Bennett to try and lobby him for his vote. And the interesting thing about Rudy Tokiwa was he would walk in on crutches, in his army uniform, right? And what he didn't tell people, though, is he walked on crutches because of a farming accident after the war. but image is everything, and he knew how to play it, right? So he goes in there, and they start talking to Charles Bennett, and Charles Bennett essentially says, look, I'm not going to support this bill. I'm not going to vote for any bill that makes my country apologize to anybody, so you might as well leave. So the two community activists get up and they leave. Rudy stays. And Charles Bennett looks at him and says, didn't you hear what I just said? You can leave. And Rudy says to him, well, before I leave, I just wanted to say thank you. And Charles Bennett says, thank you? I told you I'm not going to vote for your bill. He says, no, I want to thank you for your service as a veteran. And as a wounded veteran, because I know you think about that bullet that's in your back every day, just like I think about the bullet that's in my back. Rudy
Whoa.
Tokiwa had done his homework. He knew that Charles Bennett was a veteran. And so Charles Bennett looks at him and says, yeah, and this is Rudy telling me the story. So Rudy says, yeah, he looked at me and he says, you are right, you son of a bitch, now leave. Yeah. So Rudy says, all right. And so he leaves, but he calls Charles Bennett's um, office every day for several weeks saying, make sure he votes for this bill. Make sure he votes for this bill. Charles Bennett tells his staff, tell that guy I'll vote for his bill. Just leave us alone, right? Well, that was in June of 1987. The bill hits the floor September 17th, 1987. And by that time, Charles Bennett has once again changed his mind and says, I'm not voting for this bill. It's too expensive. It's going to cost us too much money. Well, the bill is being argued on the House floor, and Representative Norm Mineta, who was in the Congress, Japanese American, walks up to Charles Bennett and says, hey, do you see who's up in the rafters? And so Charles Bennett turns around, looks up in the handicapped section with his army scarf on, staring at him is Rudy Tokiwa, right? I can't tell you what Charles Bennett thought in the moment, but I can tell you how Charles Bennett voted. He voted for the bill. So again, that's just a fun story to tell, and it's even more fun when you know Rudy Tokiwa and the just the strong personality that he had. So the bill passes September 17th. It passes the House. 7 months later, it passes the Senate, and we need only one more vote or supporter, the President of the United States. And in 1988, the president was none other than Ronald Reagan. And for your listeners, Ronald Reagan was a very conservative president. And
Right.
many of us, myself included, who thought there's no way Ronald Reagan is signing this bill. It's just too progressive for his conservative stance. But for your listeners who remember Ronald Reagan, whether you agreed with his policies or not, most people would agree that Ronald Reagan was a great communicator. He had the ability to tell stories that would touch people's hearts and move them in a certain direction. Well, the opposite was true of Ronald Reagan. If you could tell him a story that would touch his heart, you could have a great advocate on your hands. The question was, what story could we tell Ronald Reagan that would get him excited about this and understand it on a personal level? Well, if you remember a few minutes ago, I told you about a soldier named Kazuo Masuda who said, I'm doing this because it's the only way that my family can have a chance in America.
Right, right.
2 weeks after he said that, Sergeant Masuda was killed in battle in Italy, fighting with the 100th 442nd. After the war, his family is released from Gila River camp in Arizona, and they try to return to their home in Santa Ana, California. And they're met with nothing but hate speech, racial taunts, and threats of bodily harm. And so the Army realizes this is a PR fiasco. One of our own fallen heroes, his own family can't move back home. So they send out a contingent of Army officers to have a medal ceremony for the Masuda family and to present them with the Distinguished Service Cross. And on that day, there was a young white American captain named Ronald Reagan, who was amongst those officers. And that night, Ronald Reagan addressed an audience, and the Masuda family was there. And he said, the blood that is soaked into the sands is all of one color. America stands unique in the world, the only country not founded on race, but on an ideal. Mr. and Mrs. Masuda is one member of the American family to another for what your son Kazuo did. Thanks. That story was relayed to President Reagan in the 80s, and his response was, I remember what those soldiers did for America. And it helped to align the whole issue of the incarceration and what had been done to fellow Americans. It aligned it with his personal and political values. And it wasn't the only reason, but it helped to make it possible for him to say, I can support this. And on August 10th, 1988, he signed the Civil Liberties Act, which gave an apology and monetary reparations to Japanese Americans. So that Kazuo Masuda story is a story of a veteran whose contributions, whose sacrifice changed the course of history, literally changed the course of history. And to answer your question, Travis, of how do we start, how do we use our story to inspire people, young people in particular? It's by telling these stories and saying, you too can change the course of history. You too can make a difference by what you do. And you never know exactly how it's going to play out. But, I think the idea of America's promise is one that resonates with many young people. And our perspective is the Japanese American soldiers fought for America's promise. And we tell that story, and it's an inspiring story, as you can tell. But now it's our turn, contemporary Americans, to continue to fight for America's promise. And yes, we're going to have different interpretations of what that means. And yes, there are issues that need to be discussed and debated and so forth. But let's engage in that civic dialogue. Let's engage in that civic debate so that we can keep America true to its promise.
So now, in your current role as head of the Go for Broke, how do you all do that? Because there's several different ways. I saw the engagement with young people, the Aloha Gala, other things, the vocal audio collection you have of every soldier that served that you can get your hands on and maintain an archive. There seems to be several ways you all have purposely done this. You know, what's your main focus to keep this moving forward?
Travis, I should hire you as our spokesperson because you just nailed it. I mean, we have a number of different things. We've created a number of videos that tell the story of the Japanese American soldiers as well as other ethnic American soldiers of World War II. The Black American soldiers who fought in the Buffalo Soldiers or as the Tuskegee Airmen. Um, we do have what's called our oral history collection, our Hanashi, which means story, oral history collection, where we have over 1,200 interviews with Japanese American soldiers. And these are like 6 hours long, some of them, so they get into great detail. And we use clips from that to also tell different stories. We have a young adult program called the Torchbearers. And this is for young adults, when we say young adults in their 20s and early 30s, to talk about one, the story, so they can be inspired by it, but then to turn the question and say, so how can you serve? Not necessarily in the military only, but how
Right.
can you serve in any walk of life to advance America's promise? And the latest initiative that we have in Los Angeles, in the Little Tokyo area, is we literally will be breaking ground on a new building in February. And this will be a 330,000 square foot building that will include not only space for our organization, but for legacy businesses and shops in the Little Tokyo area, and 248 affordable housing units that will serve the needs of downtown Los Angeles. As we know, being homeless is an issue across the nation. And so, how best to begin to address this than by creating a building that will house 248 families, including 1/4 of those are reserved for veterans. So
Nice, nice. What's it like personally to talk to these World War II veterans and see, this story impact you personally, Doctor?
there's a Japanese phrase that is "okage sama de," because of you, I am, and
Wow.
that's the feeling. I mean, there aren't a lot of veterans left. You know, uh, the ones that I interact with are literally 100 years old. You know, one of them just celebrated his birthday on Monday, and he's 101. Because of them, I am.
Yeah.
Because of what they did, I had the opportunity to go to school, to pursue a career in telling their story. Um, and I've had the privilege of enjoying being an American citizen in a way that they literally had to fight and die for.
Yeah.
And Travis, I would love to bring one of them on to a podcast at some point if that's in the future for us. If you meet them, they are some of the most humble folks that you will ever meet. They'll say literally, I didn't do anything, or yeah, I did what I had to do type of thing. Um, and there's an element of truth in that. They did what they had to do, but it changed the course of history, not only for the Japanese American community, but really for all Americans who cherish the Constitution and who cherish our sense that, being an American again isn't about the color of your skin or where you're from or what faith you believe in. It's, are you loyal to this nation?
There's so much to unpack. Like, we cannot get this done in one conversation,
I
Doctor.
told you we could go on.
We could be here for 6 hours easy, and time has flown by. So I'm gonna have you back on. We're gonna talk about this more, but I think I knew about this story. We studied it in the Marine Corps, of course, as part of Marine Corps history about what had happened, but not so much in school, not so much in, the video games are very good about certain things in history, but not what you all did. And, those World War II veterans are leaving us at an
Yeah.
alarming rate. So it's just really cool, humbling, inspiring to see this work go on. How can people connect to your organization or help out or advocate?
Well, the easiest way is to go to our website, goforbroke.org, and check out some of the different things that you've been able to look at and see what's of interest to them. Certainly, they can reach out to us through the website and contact and say what they're interested in. We do have an exhibition that is open on the weekends in the Little Tokyo area of downtown Los Angeles, and that's on the corner of First and Central. So that's something that people could come and visit us and find out more about us. And certainly drop us an email if there is any question or thoughts about how we can interact. And Travis, I would be more than delighted to come back on and continue this discussion. We've only scratched the surface.
Not even. I'd like to say that we haven't, Doctor. I mean, I know we haven't, and it's just bugging me that we just can't spend the next 8 hours talking like this. So that's a promise. We're gonna make this happen. Where there's a will, there's a way. We're going for broke, Doctor.
All right, I like it. Love it, love it, love it.
Ladies and gentlemen, with Dr. Mitchell Maki from Go for Broke National Education Center. What an amazing story of generational service and honor for family, honor and duty to country. Doctor, you'll be back on soon, and I just can't wait. So again, the website will be in the Oscar Mike Radio show post. Doctor, thank you again, as we say in Oscar Mike Radio.
Travis, thank you for the work that you do.
Appreciate it. We're mission in flight.
Remember, Honor teaches our mission. We care about it, we do it every day. But I think there are things that just hit you and give you a reason to go on. The theme for our 2024 for Reach Across America is Live with Purpose. It just seemed to fit in with the vows of the REAP, the 10 attributes that we feel represent our United States military. I thought, what a great opportunity to put those two things together and show our kids through how we act some of the things that can make their lives better, their communities better, and by doing that, the country better. For me, Live with Purpose, I think, it's a mindset. Set some guidelines and then go out and purposefully make life different, make a change. It's an opportunity to set an example.
Thank you for listening and watching Oscar Mike Radio, where our active duty service members and veterans are in action and the mission is in flight. Oscar Mike Radio is an oversized load Co-Sinister One production. If you are a veteran or know a veteran who needs help, please dial 988 and press 1 for the Veterans Crisis Line.